The castle of Valethorn had not known real peace in 100 years, not the kind of peace where a man could close his eyes and trust the world to still be standing when he opened them again. The peace it knew was thin, stretched over old wounds like a bandage that never quite healed. 100 years ago, on a night nobody in the castle liked to talk about, the king's own guards turned against him. Men who had eaten at the same table, who had sworn the same oath, who had laughed together over cups of wine the very same morning, picked up their blades that night and used them on their brothers. The old king, Roderick's great-grandfather, was killed in his own hall. Half the royal guard died defending him. The other half were the ones holding the knives. Nobody ever fully explained why it happened. Some said it was a bribe from a rival kingdom. Some said it was old jealousy that had been rotting quietly for years. Whatever the reason, the result was the same. Trust, in the house of Valethorn, became something nobody could afford anymore. The wolves who survived that night, because the royal guard of Valethorn were not ordinary men, they were shifters, wolves who could walk as men, and men who could run as wolves, made themselves a promise. Never again would they let their guard down. Never again would they sleep so deeply that a blade could find them before they even opened their eyes. And they kept that promise. For 100 years, they kept it. The wolves of Valethorn did not sleep the way normal people slept. They dozed in short pieces, always ready to snap awake. Even in their human shape, sitting at dinner, or standing watch by a door, part of them stayed alert, like a candle that never fully went out, even when the room was dark. If you asked any of them, they would tell you wolves simply didn't need much rest. That was the story they told visitors, and even themselves, so often that some of them had almost started to believe it. But everyone who lived inside those castle walls for more than a few weeks knew the truth. The wolves were tired, bone tired, the kind of tired that sits behind the eyes and never really leaves. They had been tired for 100 years, and nobody had found a way to fix that, because the thing that was broken wasn't their bodies, it was their trust. And trust doesn't heal just because time passes. Sometimes it needs something else, something nobody in that castle had thought to try. King Roderick Valethorn was 29 years old, though most days he felt much older. He had grown up hearing the story of his great-grandfather's murder so many times that it had become a part of him, like a scar he'd been born with instead of one he'd earned. His own father had raised him with one rule above all others: trust nobody completely, not even the people closest to you, because the people closest to you are the ones who can hurt you the most. It was not a happy way to grow up. But it kept him alive, and it kept the kingdom standing, and for a long time Roderick told himself that was enough. He ruled fairly. He was not a cruel king. He listened to his people, settled disputes without favoring the rich over the poor, and made sure no child in his lands went hungry if he could help it. But there was a wall around him that nobody could get past, not his advisors, not his old friends from childhood, not even the women his court kept trying to introduce him to, in hopes of a marriage that would finally give the kingdom an heir. He watched his guards grow thinner around the eyes with each passing year. He watched Gareth, his most trusted man and the closest thing he had to a friend, rub at his temples during council meetings like he was trying to push away a headache that never really left. He watched young Finn, barely past 20, flinch at loud sounds the way a much older man might. He watched old Doric, the longest-serving of them all, refuse to sit with his back to any door, in any room, ever. Roderick knew what was happening to his men. He knew it was his fault, in a way, because he was the one who kept reminding them to stay sharp, stay alert, never let the guard down. But he did not know how to stop it, because stopping it felt like inviting the past to repeat itself. So the castle stayed the way it had been for 100 years. Careful, watchful, tired. Mira Voss arrived at Valethorn Castle on a cold morning in early autumn, carrying everything she owned in a single bag and a letter of recommendation from the innkeeper she used to work for in a small town 2 days south. She was not from a noble family. She had grown up the daughter of a healer in a small village, learning how to mix herbs for fevers and how to sit quietly with people who were frightened or in pain. Her mother used to say that some people had loud gifts, gifts you could see from far away, and some people had quiet gifts, gifts that only showed themselves once you were close enough to feel them. Mira, her mother always said, had the quiet kind. She came to the castle looking for steady work, nothing more. She had no idea, walking through those tall gates with her bag on her shoulder, that she was about to become the answer to a problem nobody in that castle had been able to solve in 100 years. The head housekeeper, a stern but kind woman named Old Bettina, put her to work right away, folding linens, carrying tea trays, helping in the kitchen when extra hands were needed. It was simple work, the kind of work that let a person blend into the walls of a large castle without anyone paying too much attention to them. That suited Mira just fine. She was not the kind of person who wanted attention. She liked watching more than being watched. She noticed things other people missed, the way a servant's hand shook when they were nervous, the way silence in a room could mean many different things depending on who was sitting in it. And within her first few weeks at Valethorn, she noticed something strange about the king's guard. They never really rested. Even when they sat down to eat, even when they were technically off duty, there was a tightness in their shoulders that never went away. She watched Sir Gareth eat an entire meal without once looking fully relaxed, his eyes flicking to the door every few minutes like clockwork. She watched young Finn stand near the kitchen entrance during his break, instead of sitting, as if sitting down for too long felt dangerous. She didn't understand it at first. She only knew, the way she had always known things about people, that something in this castle was tired, in a way that food and sleep alone could not fix. The first real conversation she had with any of the guard happened almost by accident. She was carrying a tray of bread to the small dining hall used by the off-duty guards, and Sir Gareth was sitting alone at the long table, staring at nothing in particular. He was a big man, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of face that had probably smiled a lot once, years ago, before it had learned to stay serious most of the time. "You're new," he said, not looking up right away. "6 weeks now," Mira answered, setting the bread down. "Feels shorter than that," he said. Then, almost like he was surprised at himself for saying anything at all, he added, "This place makes weeks feel like days, and days feel like weeks. Never figured out why." Mira didn't say anything clever back. She wasn't the type. She just said, "Maybe because nobody here really stops." Gareth looked up at her, then properly, for the first time. There was something in his eyes. Not suspicion exactly, but the careful look of a man deciding whether a stranger's words meant more than they seemed to. "No," he said slowly. "Nobody here stops." He didn't explain further, and she didn't ask him to. She simply nodded, the way you'd nod at someone who told you it was raining outside, a fact stated plainly, and accepted the same way. Then she went back to her work. But something about that short exchange stayed with him. She could tell, because the next evening, and the evening after that, he found reasons to eat his meals near the kitchen instead of alone at the long table. Word moves quickly in a castle, especially among the staff who work in the kitchens and hallways where everyone eventually passes through. Within a month, most of the household knew that the new girl, Mira, had a strange effect on the guard. Nobody could quite explain what it was. She wasn't beautiful in the loud way that turned heads across a room. She didn't flirt, didn't flatter, didn't try to win anyone over with clever words. She was just calm, steadily, boringly, wonderfully calm, in a place that had forgotten what calm even felt like. Young Finn was the next one to fall under whatever quiet spell she carried with her, though it happened in a much more embarrassing way than Gareth's slow warming. Finn was the youngest of the guard, only 22, and he had joined not long after his 18th birthday, eager to prove himself worthy of the uniform his father had worn before him. He tried very hard to act like the older guards, stern and watchful, but underneath that effort he was still, in many ways, just a young man who missed his mother's cooking and got embarrassed easily. One afternoon, carrying a heavy crate of supplies down a narrow hallway, he tripped over an uneven stone and went sprawling, sending the crate's contents rolling in every direction. Apples bounced off the walls. A jar of honey cracked open and spread slowly across the floor. And Finn, red in the face, scrambled to gather everything up before anyone important could see. Mira, coming around the corner at that exact moment, saw the whole thing. She didn't laugh, though she wanted to a little. She simply crouched down and started helping him collect the scattered apples, sliding them back into the crate one by one. "Don't tell Sir Gareth," Finn said quickly, his ears burning red. "He already thinks I'm clumsy." "I won't tell anyone," Mira said. "Everyone trips sometimes." "Not the guard," Finn muttered. "We're supposed to be perfect." Mira looked at him for a moment, this young man barely out of boyhood, trying so hard to carry a weight that clearly did not fit his shoulders yet. "Nobody's perfect," she said simply. "Not even kings, especially not kings, probably." Finn laughed at that, a short, surprised laugh, like it had escaped him before he could stop it. It was, though neither of them realized it at the time, the first real laugh he had let out in longer than he could remember. After that day, Finn started finding small reasons to be near the kitchen whenever Mira was working there. He told himself it was because the honey jars needed restocking, or because he was checking on supply counts, but everyone else could see it for what it was. He simply felt better when she was nearby. Old Doric was the hardest one to reach. He had been part of the guard since before Roderick was even born, and he had lost more that terrible night 100 years ago than almost anyone else still living. His younger brother had been one of the guards holding the blades that night, one of the traitors, though nobody had ever proven whether he'd chosen it or been forced into it. Doric never spoke about it. He simply carried the weight of it, silently, every single day. He was the one who, after the culling, had gone 11 days without properly sleeping, staying up night after night watching every door and window in the castle, convinced that if he closed his eyes even for a moment, something terrible would happen again. 11 days. By the end of it, his hands shook so badly he could barely hold his sword, and the old king at the time had to order him, personally, to rest before Doric would allow himself to stop. He never fully forgot that fear. 100 years later, it still lived somewhere in his chest, quiet most days, but never completely gone. Mira first noticed him standing near the solar door one evening, not going in, not walking away, just standing there, like a man caught between two decisions. "You can come in, you know," she said, not looking up from the mending in her lap. "I don't bite." Doric grunted, which from him was practically a full conversation, but he stepped inside anyway and settled into a chair near the far wall, keeping his back to the corner where he could see both the door and the window at the same time. Old habits. She didn't push him to talk. She simply kept mending, humming quietly under her breath, the same tune her mother used to hum while grinding herbs for medicine. It was nothing special, just a simple little melody, but there was something steady about it, something that didn't demand anything from the person listening. Doric sat there for nearly an hour that first evening, saying almost nothing, just listening to the quiet sounds of the room, her humming, the needle pulling through cloth, the small crackle of the fire. When he finally stood to leave, he paused at the door. "Haven't sat like that in a long while," he said, not quite looking at her. "Like what?" Mira asked. "Without checking the door every few seconds," he admitted. He left before she could respond, but he came back the next evening, and the one after that. Weeks passed this way. Slowly, quietly, without anyone making a big announcement about it, the solar became a kind of gathering place for the off-duty guard. They would drift in one or two at a time, find a spot to sit, and simply exist in the same room as Mira while she went about her small tasks, mending, folding linens, sometimes just reading by candlelight. Nobody talked about why they kept coming back. It wasn't the kind of thing men like Gareth or Doric would put into words easily, but the truth was simple enough, even if none of them said it out loud. Around Mira, nobody expected anything from them. She didn't need them to be strong or perfect or endlessly alert. She just let them be tired, without making that tiredness feel like a weakness. And slowly, their bodies began to remember something they had forgotten how to do. They began, in small pieces, to actually rest. The day everything changed was an ordinary gray Tuesday, the kind of day that felt like it belonged to no particular season, caught somewhere between autumn and winter. Mira had been mending a torn cloak in the solar, sitting near the window where the weak afternoon light gave her just enough to see her stitches by. She hadn't meant to fall asleep. She simply felt her eyes grow heavy, the needle slowing in her hand, and before she quite realized what was happening, she had drifted off in her chair, with the cloak still bundled in her lap. King Roderick found her there about an hour later. He had been looking for a report he'd misplaced somewhere in the solar the day before, and when he pushed open the door, expecting an empty room, what he found instead stopped him completely in the doorway. Mira was asleep in her chair, and gathered around her, on the floor, on the cushions, in whatever space they had claimed for themselves, were 3 of his guard, fast asleep. Sir Gareth had his head resting against the arm of her chair, close enough that his shoulder nearly touched her knee. Young Finn was curled up on the floor nearby, one arm thrown over his face, breathing slow and even like a boy half his age. And Doric, who had once gone 11 days without closing his eyes, who still to that day refused to sit with his back to a door, was stretched out flat on the floor, mouth slightly open, snoring softly like the most ordinary tired man in the world. Roderick stood frozen in the doorway for a long moment, unable to move, unable to speak, watching his 3 most guarded, most careful men sleep more peacefully than he had ever seen them sleep in his entire life. He thought about waking them. His first instinct, trained into him since childhood, was that this looked wrong somehow, dangerous somehow. 3 armed men fully asleep, unguarded, unaware. Every lesson his father had taught him screamed that this was exactly the kind of moment the old stories warned about. But he made himself stand still and actually look, instead of just reacting. He looked at Gareth's face, slack and calm for the first time in years, none of the constant tightness around his eyes. He looked at Finn, breathing easy, no flinching, no tension in his shoulders. He looked at Doric, and for one strange, aching moment, Roderick thought he could see, underneath the lines 100 years had carved into that old face. The young man Doric must have been once, before the culling took his brother and his peace at the same time. Something loosened in Roderick's chest. Not all at once, just a small amount, like a rope that had been pulled tight for so long finally being allowed a little slack. He did not wake them. He stepped back out of the room as quietly as he had entered, and he closed the door gently behind him, leaving his guard to sleep. He found Mira later that evening, after she had woken on her own and the guard had scattered back to their duties, looking slightly embarrassed but not particularly ashamed about the whole thing. "They're not usually like that," Roderick said, standing near the doorway of the solar, the way a man stands when he isn't quite sure if he's allowed inside his own room, around anyone. Mira looked up from where she was folding the mended cloak. "They were tired," she said simply, as if that explained everything, which, in a way, it did. "They're always tired," Roderick said. "That's not new. What's new is that they let themselves actually rest." He crossed the room slowly and sat down in the chair across from hers, the same chair Gareth had leaned against just hours before. Up close, Mira could see the same tiredness in the king's own face, though he hid it better than his men did, or maybe he had simply had longer to practice hiding it. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You're the king," Mira said. "You can ask whatever you want." "That's not really an answer to whether I should," he said, and there was the faintest hint of a smile at the corner of his mouth, so small she almost missed it. She set the cloak aside. "Go ahead." "What did you do to them?" he asked. "Truly, I need to understand it." Mira thought about the question carefully before answering, the way she thought about most things. "I don't think I did anything exactly," she said. "I didn't try to fix anyone. I just wasn't anything they needed to be careful around. I'm not important. I'm not dangerous. I don't want anything from them except maybe help carrying a heavy crate now and then." She paused. "I think that's rare in a place like this. Someone safe enough that you can stop watching the door for a while." Roderick was quiet for a long moment, turning her words over. "100 years," he said finally, so quietly it was almost to himself. 100 years, and none of us found that. Not the best healers, not the wisest advisors, not even I could give them that. He looked at her, something raw and unguarded in his expression that surprised even him. "And you did it without trying." "I didn't do it," Mira said again, gently. "I think they did it themselves. I just gave them a room to do it in." Word of what had happened in the solar spread through the castle within days, the way any interesting story does among people who live and work closely together. Some of the older staff, who remembered the stories of the culling firsthand from their own parents and grandparents, shook their heads with worry. "It's not natural," muttered old Bettina to the cook one morning, though she kept her voice low enough that Mira wouldn't hear. "Guards falling asleep like children in the middle of the day. What happens if something comes for us while they're dreaming?" The cook, a heavy-set man named Ellis, who had worked in that kitchen for 30 years, only shrugged. "Seems to me they've been half asleep on their feet for 100 years anyway, walking around all tired and jumpy. Maybe actual rest makes them sharper, not weaker. Ever think of that?" Bettina didn't have an answer for that, but she kept a careful eye on things anyway, the way old and cautious people often do. Not everyone in the castle was as understanding as Ellis. Lord Howrick, one of Roderick's senior advisors, a thin, sharp-eyed man who had served the crown for over 20 years, brought his concerns directly to the king within the week. "Your Majesty," Howrick said, standing stiffly in the throne room, with his hands folded behind his back, "forgive my bluntness, but there are whispers spreading through the castle that your personal guard has grown soft, that they nap in the middle of the day like house cats instead of standing watch. I understand the intentions behind allowing this, but intentions do not stop knives in the dark." Roderick considered the man carefully before answering. Howrick was not wrong to worry. That was the trouble with 100 years of careful watching. Even the people who wanted to trust again didn't quite know how, and every change felt like a risk nobody could afford. "I hear your concern," Roderick said finally, "and I won't pretend it isn't fair. But tell me, Howrick, in the past 100 years, how many times has our guard actually stopped a real threat because they never slept? And how many of them have worn themselves down to nothing, jumping at shadows, exhausted past the point of clear thinking?" Howrick had no answer for that either, though his frown remained firmly in place. "I'm not asking them to stop being careful," Roderick continued. "I'm only allowing them, for the first time in 100 years, to be careful without destroying themselves in the process. There's a difference even if it's hard to see from the outside." Howrick bowed stiffly and said nothing further, though it was clear from his face that he remained unconvinced. The true test of Roderick's decision came not long after, in a way none of them had expected. Valethorn shared an uneasy border with the neighboring territory of Ashcombe, ruled by a proud and ambitious lord named Cedric Thorn. There had never been open war between the two lands, but there had also never been much warmth, only the careful, watchful distance of two powers who did not fully trust one another. Word reached the castle that Lord Thorn had sent a small group of travelers toward Valethorn, officially described as merchants seeking trade, though the timing felt suspicious to anyone paying close attention. Howrick, predictably, saw this as proof of exactly the danger he had warned about. "If your guard truly has grown careless," he said to Roderick privately, "now would be precisely the moment for our neighbors to test that weakness." Roderick did not dismiss the warning this time. He called his guard together, Gareth, Finn, Doric, and the dozen or so others who made up the Royal Watch, and explained the situation plainly. "I won't pretend there's no risk," he told them, standing in the small council room where the guard usually gathered before their shifts. "But I also won't go back to the way things were before. We rest now, when we can. We watch, when we must. I trust you to know the difference, because I've seen, these past weeks, that you're sharper for it, not weaker." Gareth, standing at the front of the group, nodded once, firm and steady. "We won't fail you, Your Majesty." The merchant party arrived 3 days later, a modest group of 6 men with 2 loaded carts, requesting lodging for the night, before continuing their journey. On the surface, everything about their visit seemed ordinary. They spoke politely, traded fairly with the castle's steward for a few goods, and kept mostly to themselves in the guest quarters set aside for travelers. But Doric noticed something wrong almost immediately. He had taken the late watch that night, standing near the guest quarters more out of quiet habit than any particular suspicion, and because he was rested, truly rested for the first time in longer than he could remember, his mind was clear in a way it hadn't been in years. He noticed the small things. The way one of the so-called merchants kept glancing toward the corridor that led to the castle's private records room, instead of toward the kitchens or the courtyard, the places an actual merchant might wander out of simple curiosity. He noticed the man's boots, too fine and too clean for someone who claimed to have traveled 3 days on dusty roads. Instead of confronting the man directly, Doric quietly signaled Gareth, who was resting nearby, but woke instantly, alert and clear-headed, the moment he felt the light tap on his shoulder. They watched together, saying nothing, simply observing. And sure enough, once the rest of the household had gone quiet for the night, the suspicious traveler slipped out of the guest quarters and made his way carefully toward the records corridor, clearly expecting the halls to be empty and unwatched at that late hour, the way they had been for so many uneventful years before. He was surprised, quite badly, to find Gareth and Doric standing calmly in his path, arms crossed, waiting. There was no fight, no blades drawn, no blood spilled. The man, caught plainly in the act with no way to explain himself, simply raised his hands and admitted, after a short and rather nervous conversation, that Lord Thorn had sent him to gather information about Valethorn's defenses and treasury records, hoping to find weaknesses to use in future negotiations, or worse, in future conflict. Roderick was woken and informed immediately. By morning the entire matter had been resolved quietly and firmly. The spy and his companions were escorted to the border under guard and sent back toward Ashcombe with a clear message for Lord Thorn, that Valethorn's guard remained exactly as sharp as it had ever been, and perhaps sharper, and that any future attempts at such games would not end so gently. Word of the incident spread through the castle quickly, and this time the whispers carried a very different tone. Halric himself came to Roderick the next morning, looking somewhat humbled. "It seems I was wrong to worry, Your Majesty," he admitted. "It was Doric who noticed the trouble, was it not? The very man everyone assumed had grown soft from too much rest." "He noticed because he was rested," Roderick said. "A tired mind misses things, Halric. It always has. We simply never allowed ourselves to test the difference before." Even old Bettina, still cautious by nature, had to admit over her morning tea that perhaps she had misjudged the whole situation. "Maybe there's something to it after all," she said to Ellis the cook. "Rested men catching spies while the rest of us slept soundly through the whole thing. Never would have guessed it." In the days that followed, something shifted in the castle that was hard to name but easy to feel. The guard still trained hard, still stood their watches, still took their duties as seriously as ever. But the constant, grinding tension that had hung over Valethorn for 100 years had loosened, just slightly, like a held breath finally allowed to release. Finn, who had once flinched at loud sounds and apologized constantly for imagined clumsiness, began to laugh more easily, more often, the awkward embarrassment of youth softening into something closer to genuine confidence. He still tripped over things occasionally, but now he laughed about it himself, before anyone else could tease him. Gareth found himself, more and more, seeking out quiet moments in the solar, even when Mira wasn't there, simply because the room itself had come to feel different, safe, familiar, a place where a man could set down the weight he carried without anyone thinking less of him for it. And Doric, old Doric, who had spent 100 years refusing to sit with his back to any door, began, slowly, to allow himself small exceptions. He still preferred a clear view of the exits. Some habits, forged in the worst night of a person's life, don't simply disappear, but he no longer needed to check the door every few seconds. He no longer flinched at every unexpected sound. He had found, in a quiet room with a quiet girl humming an old tune over her mending, something he had honestly believed was lost to him forever. Roderick found himself spending more and more time in that same solar, not always with any real excuse, though he usually brought one anyway. A report to review, a letter to write, some small task that gave him a reason to sit in the same room as Mira, without it seeming like anything more than simple proximity. They talked, over those quiet evenings, about small things mostly. Her childhood in the village, learning herbs and remedies at her mother's side. His own childhood, heavier and stranger, growing up as the son of a king who trusted no one, learning to guard his heart before he had even properly grown into it. "Do you ever get tired of being careful?" she asked him one evening, the fire crackling low between them, most of the guard already dozing peacefully in their usual corners of the room. "Every single day," Roderick admitted, surprising himself with how easily the honest answer came. "I've been careful for so long I sometimes forget what it feels like not to be. And then I walk into this room, and I see my men sleeping peacefully for the first time in 100 years, and I remember, just for a moment, what I've actually been missing." Mira didn't offer him easy comfort or empty reassurance. She simply looked at him, steady and calm the way she looked at everyone, and said, "You don't have to figure it all out today. Trust doesn't come back all at once. It comes back one quiet evening at a time, same as it did for them." Roderick looked at her for a long moment, something warm and unfamiliar settling into his chest, something that felt dangerously close to hope. "I think," he said slowly, "that might be the wisest thing anyone has said to me in years." Mira smiled, small and genuine. "I didn't say it to sound wise. I just said what I believe." "That," Roderick said, "is probably why it worked." Winter came, and with it, the quiet rhythms of castle life continued, changed in small but meaningful ways from what they had been before. The guards still trained. They still watched the borders, still took their duties seriously, still remained, without question, the finest fighting force in the region, but they no longer carried themselves like men, waiting for the worst to happen at every single moment. There was a lightness to them now, hard-won and well-earned, that had not existed within those castle walls in a full century. Roderick made Mira's role in the household official that winter, though not in any grand or dramatic ceremony. He simply asked old Bettina to give her proper quarters near the solar, and made sure everyone understood that her presence there, and her open door, was something the entire castle valued and wished to protect. Nobody needed it explained further. Everyone had seen, with their own eyes, what 100 years of fear had not been able to fix, and what one quiet, steady, unremarkable young woman had managed simply by being exactly, unapologetically, herself. As for Roderick and Mira, their story did not rush toward any grand declaration. It grew slowly instead, the way real trust always does, one honest evening at a time, one shared silence at a time, one small laugh shared over spilled honey and scattered apples at a time. But if you had walked past the solar on any quiet evening that winter and peered in through the half-open door, you would have seen it plainly enough without anyone needing to say a single word out loud. You would have seen the king of Valethorn, the descendant of a murdered king, the son of a man who trusted no one, sitting close beside a healer's daughter with no title and no fortune, watching his guards sleep peacefully around them both. And for the first time in 100 years, nobody in that room was checking the door.